There's a lot of hate for 40 Smith & Wesson out there, and out of all of the advocates, one stands out as Smith & Wesson's strongest soldier. Pop, I'd like to dedicate this video to you. Yeah, so if you haven't caught on yet, this video is going to talk about 40 Smith & Wesson. I actually think it's a great round, although I do understand why it kind of fell out of favor. I'm Boondock. Welcome back, and let's get started talking about kind of the history of 40 Smith & Wesson and why it disappeared. This is one of those rounds that has become almost like a meme at this point. So any sentiments on the performance are just gonna be much more jarring compared to what they actually are. You have people who advocate it so heavily just because it's like a meme thing to do. And on the other side of the coin, people who hate it so actively just because it's a thing to do. So it's kind of tricky to find those nuances spots in the middle. Most people like to go to one of the other extremes just for the sake of the argument, which is fine. Like I said, I do actually like this round, though admittedly that does not mean it is a perfect pistol caliber. So what is 40 Smith & Wesson? A lot of you guys probably already know the history of it. There was that Miami shootout in 1990 something or another, in which the police force had determined that 9mm was a failure for them. It had proved itself to be inadequate at that time, and after this incident, the units had decided that they needed something more. Now, we all know 10mm can be a little punchy and much larger in terms of weapons on the market, meaning to a lot of these police forces, it was kind of an undesirable option to take. I don't think people kind of understand. A lot of you guys who are huge advocates for 10 and, you know, just get stronger wrists, whatever, don't realize that there are all sorts of different body sizes and people, and stronger wrists, sure, that's fine. But a police force is gonna have to cater to all possible members, and some of them just happen to be smaller, some larger than others. I can work out all I want. My forearm strength, grip strength is still probably gonna be lower than your average man. Not that I'm your standard police officer, but regardless, there are women and smaller men and everything else on the unit, so you have to accommodate. As a response to this growing demand, Smith & Wesson had decided to make a 40, taking the shortened case of a 10mm round, meaning they were able to get similar 10mm performance, but in a much smaller package. Given that information, I don't think it should surprise anybody that 10 will still provide the most energy, penetration capabilities, followed by 40 Smith & Wesson, and then of course 9mm. But when we think of modern police units, I think it's fair to say that most of us still picture them using 9mm. Of course, different units do different things. There are a load of different weapon choices and caliber choices across the nation, depending on what that specific group wants to do. But 9 didn't disappear. For something that was deemed inadequate, unsafe for the police forces to be carrying, it's kind of interesting that you see 9 prevalently in forces. So before we get into the why that probably is, I think we should kind of talk about some of the performance specifications between these rounds. Starting with 10mm versus 40 Smith & Wesson. 10's parent case is the 30 Remington round. Like I said before, 40 Smith & Wesson's parent case is the 10. So you are going to see a case capacity about 24.1 grains versus 19.3 grains for 40 Smith & Wesson. A jump in case capacity like that means you could fit in more propellant, more velocity, more pressure, everything else. So 10mm is going to hit a max pressure about 37,500, with 40 Smith & Wesson hitting a max pressure of around 35,000, give or take. Of course, there's different loads. This isn't just a set number, but we can ballpark that. 9mm, on the other hand, is going to have a 13.3 grain case capacity, which is notably different than the other two, and will still also hit a max pressure of around 35,000. When comparing bullet drop between these two rounds, you're going to see 9mm dropping off about 14, give or take, inches at 100 yards, whereas 40 Smith & Wesson will see about a 16-inch drop at 100 yards. Again, This depends on what specific round you're using. And it's also a tricky conversation when you consider modern 9 rounds compared to what would have been on the market when 40 Smith & Wesson was kind of introduced. So you will see some differences in capabilities then, with 9 having much more growth in regards to performance capabilities. So while there is about a 2-inch difference in drop at 100 yards, pretty comparable. I mean, not to say that's not notable, but when you consider 10 mil, that's actually going to see the lowest bullet drop at 100 yards. I believe a lot of the bullet drop for 10 can even hit like sub 10 inches at that distance. It is going to have a significantly flatter trajectory than the other 2 options, which I can see why people like 10 at that point. But when you start to really dig into the specs of these, considering velocity capabilities, wounding capabilities, it really becomes a game of just picking what you prefer. 10 might have the flattest trajectory. 10, of course, has the most energy and the most lethality capabilities, but it is a larger frame. It does have notably more recoil. And sure, that heavier kick can become manageable depending on the right training, better grip strengths, everything else you can do, but that doesn't change the fact that it is still something that would have to be worked at more to make it a comfortable and reliable shot. And when we're talking about defense, police units, military forces, you don't want to have to do all of that extra work just to make something bearable. 9mm, of course, does have limitations, and given the incident at hand, I can see why they wanted to push for something different. So 40 did become that good middle ground between the two. While it still does have a little bit more kick than 9mm would, it's notably less than 10mm, and to that point, it's smaller frame guns, which means easier to manage that recoil if you can get better grips, more options in regards to what firearm you're putting them out with, and can really fine tune to help mitigate any of that extra oomph coming out. So I think we can all agree 40 is a ideal intermediate between these 2 rounds. Still doesn't explain why it kind of quickly fell off. I think the biggest hangup for this caliber was advancements in production, propellants, case manufacturing, everything else that allowed 9mm to develop plus P capabilities, which meant suddenly now 9 is able to hit the same power capabilities that you would expect out of a 40 Smith & Wesson. But in my mind, I say, hey, all of that production capability, all of that manufacturing increases capabilities, wouldn't that just transfer over to 40? That should be applicable to, you know, all sorts of rounds at that point. And you would be correct. In a perfect world, we would see 40 Smith & Wesson start to also push its capabilities, its limits, as we're able to really fine tune the propellants that are going into it. We can manufacture different cases that can withstand those pressures better, or perhaps have more internal volume because our capability of getting certain hardness gradients have improved. So why didn't 40 follow suit? Why didn't we start to see those 40 rounds also make similar strides in terms of capabilities? And that, my friend, is going to be a byproduct of the commercial market. I think it is something that a lot of people heavily overlook, especially people who are more against firearms. We'd like to complain about the DoD budget and how excessive it is, but I don't think people realize how much the civilian market drives what military and police forces are going to be doing. There was still a huge push on the civilian end for 9mm options. It was comfortable, people had it. Buying new guns costs money, buying all new magazines and ammo if you have a lot in stock. It's a change for the average person just to go over to 40 just because, hey, the police are going over to 40. The 9 works just fine for me. The 9's a fun range toy. I feel safe in my home with it, so I am okay with it. And because the civilian market was still so heavily driving interest in 9mm capabilities, you did still see a lot of new weapons coming out. You saw a lot more effort going into making 9 more viable, and consequently, more market push on one end meant that as 9 progressed, 40 just fell behind. There wasn't enough drive from the police units themselves to warrant that much R&D effort into making new guns and new ammo capabilities within that caliber. And as 9 slowly bridged the gap, that became worse and worse as you went on, meaning 40 fell. It fell off. 9 is now catching up. +9 capabilities can hit a recoil energy of like 7.3, which is still significantly lower than 40 Smith & Wesson. That's gonna hit around 10 for like a recoil energy rating. And while it's not that much, when you consider recoil velocity and your overall like impulse type score, they wind up becoming more notably different. Looking back at some of the shooting footage, I think it becomes a little bit more obvious that I was struggling, for lack of a better word, more with the 40 Smith & Wesson. Not that I thought it was a bad shot, and I really didn't think much of it at the time, but when you're reviewing footage between that and 9, I think you could see a little bit less control on my end with the 40. It definitely does seem like the muzzle's kind of flipping up a lot more, and I'm having a harder time maintaining it, which if you're taking successive shots, needs to have a quick, effective follow-up, that definitely is going to be a downside. But I will say I'm going to go ahead and blame that specific firearm to a degree. While 40 does have a bit more kick to it, there's no denying that one. The firearm that I was shooting for some of this footage here was a little bit on the larger end. The grips for that were kind of hard for me to get a good hold on. I have shot guns and 40 Smith & Wesson that I thought were much more manageable. Conversely, I have shotguns that I thought were far worse manageable. I think like every other caliber, the weapon that you're choosing does make a difference, but I will say, I don't think I've ever picked up a 9mm and thought it had a little bit of kick. 40 Smith & Wesson, on the other hand, can argue some ways or the other, depending. And of course, that's always going to be more subjective from shooter to shooter as well. So now we have way less recoil, still a smaller package, and velocity, energy, wounding capabilities that are pretty damn neck and neck. 40 still does give a larger wound channel compared to 9, but not large enough to warrant using it anymore. For companies to continue to expand their efforts towards 40 Smith & Wesson, it would wind up having to be a large loss for the company to kind of push forward those efforts. And I hope that the market would follow suit afterward and that a product would come out that would kind of resurge the interest in this caliber. Quite frankly, I don't blame companies for not wanting to do so. It is a big risk given what current market trends are, especially how 9 has continued to grow in popularity and prominence. You would have to kind of come up with something pretty revolutionary to make a breakthrough again for 40 in the market and repopularize that. So, while I find 40 Smith & Wesson to be a beautiful intermediate, and I think it could have capabilities much more than what it's currently seeing available to consumers, it makes sense that you don't want to take the risk in manufacturing something that, quite frankly, is probably going to be done at a loss, at least for a notable chunk of time. That's all I had for you guys on this one, kind of a quick and sweet. There are a lot of debates and conversations about this round, so just my 2 cents, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you all on the next one.
You get it? Fuck that road up. Go, go, go. Maze. Did you get it? No. You did. That's okay.